A Primarch video. I love the smell of algorithm in the morning.
Notice me! No!
Okay, all jokes aside, I think you guys will like this one because it's a really interesting sort of thought experiment. I'm gonna be ranking all the Primarch homeworlds from best to worst, and my parameters for doing so I think might prove interesting. There's 4 main categories that I'm using: best, unpleasant, dangerous, and worst. The best ones being obviously the ones someone would most likely want to be born onto, that you'd have the best time. The unpleasant being ones that just generally suck, that are just miserable or even crime-ridden. Dangerous are for those planets which are either geologically unstable or have highly predatory life or climates. And worst are for those planets that had a very overreaching consequence for the plot and whose existence may well have doomed the galaxy. And that's the really interesting one. Now, before we get to those planets, let's knock out the ones that were the best in my opinion. And number 1 to me is Prospero. That world was, when Magnus landed on it, effectively a paradise. Progressive, full of learning, full of acceptance. On any other planet, baby Magnus might have just been crushed with a rock, but here he was risen up, nurtured, and allowed to grow. It kind of makes Magnus's fall all the more tragic, because it wasn't the fault of the planet he was raised on, he didn't have an awful upbringing, he probably had one of the best upbringings of any of the Primarchs, but it was his own fault. His own arrogance in his abilities that caused his downfall and the downfall of the Imperium. But aside from that, Prospero, and especially their one city of Tisca, was probably the best place in the galaxy to be. Honestly, I really can't think of a single thing wrong with it. All the problems came after the fact, sure, it got a little spicy, but that isn't something a no dog sign won't fix. Behind Prospero, in my mind, would be Macragge, homeworld of Roboute Guilliman and the Ultramarines, because Macragge is what I like to call Earth-like. It had an effective administration, the climate and terrain maybe not the best, but still pretty good, and coupled with the high standard of living, the fact that they had their own interstellar empire, and a level of balance in terms of what people could do on the planet. It wasn't like a hive city or an agri-world where the entire planet is given over to one specific thing. You had opportunity and mobility. Sure, it wasn't the utopia of Prospero or Tisca, but it was very comparable to Earth. And even the better parts of Earth, I would say. I don't want to say better, I mean better places to live, like Sweden or Denmark. In fact, people would actually retire to the realm of Ultramar, if not Macragge itself, but similar planets like Kalf. Number 3 on this list, and starting to get into the planets that are more noticeably flawed, yeah, that was fast, is Olympia, the planet of the Primarch Perturabo and the Iron Warriors. Now, Olympia could be best thought of as sort of a Greco-Roman kind of vibe, similar to the more hardcore Roman Macragge and Nuceria. This is because it mainly consisted of warring city-states in the mountains, or polis as they would be known to us here on Earth. Now, these city-states, while they were in constant conflict and squabbled with each other, it was at least a more quote-unquote civilized level of warfare. These were not barbarian hordes who would bust down the gates and burn each other alive. Your city-state might switch hands and tyrants, sure, but if you were the average person, you could get by well enough on your own. And the planet itself was fairly technologically advanced. That's a big thing. We take technological advancement very much for granted, but those planets with lower technology were consistently less pleasant to live on than the more advanced ones. I'm sorry, whatever you think that you'd do in the Roman Empire, it's not as good as living now. You would be given a generally high life expectancy and could be expected to lead a basically average life. Now, the mountainous rough terrain, again, not great, but still not that bad, especially in comparison to what we have here on Earth. They had a decent economy and a solid social structure, which is a lot more than can be said about some of the other planets. Number 4, to my mind, and rounding out the good worlds, would have to be Terra. Specifically, near post-Unity Terra, where the planet was almost entirely under the Emperor's banner. That's because this is where Alfarius would land and be found first. Now, I want to specify, Omegon doesn't count, because whatever planet he landed on, we have basically no idea, and it was effectively devoid of life. He was raised more or less alone. So given the lack of any proper frame of reference, we can discount him. Now, the reason I put Imperial Terra here is because at this time, most of the planet had been brought to compliance by the Thunder Warriors. If you were born in one of those parts that still wasn't compliant, yeah, you might be in for a rough time, but odds are you wouldn't be. Most of the largest, most populous areas of the world were compliant and as such had a standard of living that was decent. Industry was online, the techno-barbarians were gone, the rule of law was established. It wasn't great, and the climate wasn't particularly amazing, but also not horrible. I guess think of maybe something like Australia, where it's a little more arid, but not too hot to be unlivable, or too cold. It was alright, more or less, and you would be largely left alone to scrape out a basically average life. I wouldn't call it ideal, and it was probably a little worse than what we currently live through now. However, it's a hell of a lot better than what it's compared to with the other Primarch worlds, so that's why I'm rounding out the good planets with this one. Now, moving on to the unpleasant tier. These planets are maybe not the worst in the world, but they're certainly less than ideal. And this section here is a pretty varied category. There's definitely a slider here. Because number one, and the best of the unpleasant, is Chogoris. Now, a lot of you might be seething at that response because, based Mongol, for the con. But despite that rich culture and identity, and the strong people bred by this world, as well as the general kind and more human demeanor of the White Scars, it must be noted that when the Khan got there, all the clans were fighting with each other constantly. Much like Genghis Khan in our timeline, united these clans across the world, but that did fall apart as soon as he left. However, when he landed there, it must be noted they had basically black powder or even sub-black powder technology, and of course, sub-black powder medicine. Life there would be nasty, brutish, and short. You're gonna have very little to you, and you could get killed in a raid very easily. Again, much like Genghis Khan, these are the things Jagatai Khan would help to improve upon. But all things considered, definitely not a planet you're gonna wanna live on, but certainly not one of the worst ones. Now, from here on out, we start getting into the more debatable zone, and I would love to hear what you guys think about this next set of rankings. Because number 6 on the list is Chemos, the home planet of the Primarch Fulgrim and the Emperor's children. You see, Chemos was a very desolate world. All of the natural resources had been almost entirely stripped from the planet, and whoever was left behind basically had to work non-stop to keep things functioning and keep food production at a level where there wouldn't be mass starvation. Everyone was on the grind 24/7 to keep the planet alive. Now, this left no time for literally anything else. Toil from dawn until dusk, and probably through the night as well, if I'm being honest. Absolutely miserable. But the reason it's not lower is because people could at least live and survive. Yes, you're gonna be probably pretty depressed and living on borrowed time because your world will run out soon, but you were at least alive and relatively safe. The crime seems to have been more or less to a minimum because nobody really had much time to commit crime, and you weren't in any real palpable danger. You were safe, but you sure as hell weren't happy, and this definitely isn't a planet you were gonna want to be on. But again, I would take it over a lot of the other ones because, if nothing else, at least you're not in immediate danger. Now this next one is going to be the really debatable one, because number 7 on the list, not even halfway down, is Nuceria. Now please everyone constrain yourselves, I know there's going to be a lot of objections to this one, but the reason Nuceria, the home planet of the Primarch Angron, is so high up on the list for what you would expect of it, is because yes, it was awful, but there was at least a level of technology and not the absolutely abysmal level of natural predators or ecological instability. You see, on Nuceria, the entire planet was controlled and ruled by a small group of elites, like a top 1%, who lived in luxury, with large villas and palaces and all they could want and lavish games and basically anything anyone could desire, but most of the planet lived in poverty, in small slums or in small settlements, basically eking out a very minimal living. Yeah, see, this is the other half of the space Rome spectrum compared to Macragge, where it's like the late Roman Empire, where everything was really starting to go to shit. Now, the thing is, this sounds awful, but it's not too dissimilar from certain places on Earth now, as well as the climate and geological stability that is close to what I like to call the current Earth baseline. And the reason there's going to be a lot of contention for this choice is because people will say, hey, just look at Angron, look what they did to him. They hammered the butcher's nails into him, they used him as a gladiator, it was awful. Well, that is absolutely true, but that's just him. Most people, the vast majority of people, are not going to be gladiatorial slaves or have the butcher's nails implanted in them. That was a small minority. Angron was just supremely unlucky. He didn't have the worst planet, but he was definitely the least lucky Primarch in who found him. So, odds are, as a Nucerian, that won't be you. You're going to be attending those games, sure, and it'll be bread and circuses to keep you distracted from your absolutely abysmal lot in life compared to what we have here on Earth and what the other better planets had. But it's just not one of the worst planets you could find yourself on. If you were there, you could scrape your way by on your belly. You're certainly not going to be happy ever in your life, but hey, it's something. It's better than nothing. Now, the next three on this list are going to be damn near interchangeable depending on where your values sit and what you interpret as being better or worse. Number 8 on the list is Inuit, home planet of Rogel Dorn. Now, the thing with Inuit is that its weather really tips it into the negative here. It was icy, harsh, and absolutely dreary. Very little sunlight, and the sun itself was a dying star, which the planet orbited slowly, meaning half of the planet would cook and the other half would freeze in darkness for most of the year. Again, very, very unpleasant. Furthermore, what little wildlife there was very, very hostile and dangerous. Not like Fenris level of dangerous, but still pretty bad. And people would have to learn to defend themselves from a very young age because the nomadic tribes who would move from ice cave to ice cave would often come into conflict over the very, very limited resources of the world. Things would get a hell of a lot better with Rogel Dorn coming into the picture, but before he arrived, the average Inuitian was absolutely going to live a really struggle-filled life. It wasn't just miserable like Nuceria, it was hard. You had to fight to survive and do so from a young age to make sure you didn't die in a raid or in an interclan conflict or weren't killed by a wild animal. This one is pretty bad, but it is definitely overshadowed by other ones later down the list. Number 9, Nostromo, the home planet of Conrad Kurz and the Night Lord's Legion. This planet is generally known for being absolutely horrible. It was so polluted that the sunlight would barely ever reach the ground, and it was so crime-ridden because of how depressed everyone was economically by the upper classes in this society that murder was the single leading cause of death next to suicide, and there were a lot of those. This planet was horrible because not only was it completely miserable and very, very toxic, something that would absolutely affect the physiology of people born there, you were also in almost near constant danger and exposed to things like drugs or any other kind of vice or crime that would flourish in a city like this. It's like Gotham times 10. It's this absolute lack of opportunity, lack of will to live that the people had, and the sheer amount of danger you would be in, not from wildlife or geological disaster, but from the crime itself, that puts it this low on the list. Now, it's not lower because you could reasonably survive or get by as long as you just never leave your house. You will never be happy, but you can make your way if you're just really, really careful. And to round off the list of the unpleasant worlds, we have Medusa, home planet of Ferrus Manus and the Iron Hands Legion. And would it shock you to realize that I actually had to rack my brain to remember what this one was called? So, points for sticking to a theme. I literally had everything sorted into a list in a document and had to keep recounting to make sure if I was missing one. And then it hit me, oh yeah, Medusa, I forgot. I am so sorry, Iron Hands fan, whoever you are out there. This one's for you. The reason this one is so low on the list is because of the aforementioned tribal conflict. Much like Chagoris and Inuit. It can be compared to Inuit in a lot of ways, actually. You see, this constant conflict between warring factions and clans on Medusa is not only over resources, but is also for solid, firm land, because there is very little safe land on the planet. Most of it is shifting, unstable, prone to earthquakes, and yes, even volcanic activity. The planet is very volcanically active and constantly splitting and shifting apart, which is why the tribes need to stay constantly on the move. coupled with the effects of this volcanic activity making the sky very dark almost all of the time, full of soot and ash. The fact that if you stay in one place for too long, your odds of literally falling through the crust of the earth into the mantle keep going up is a bit of a killer for real estate. You are never safe and can never truly settle. Furthermore, you also have to deal with other clans who are very likely to kill you if you have something they want or just happen to be in the way of their well-being. You can't avoid trouble on Medusa, it's going to find you. And while yes, it is similar to Inuit in this regard in almost every way, that massive geological instability and even more ruthless clan warfare puts it lower on the list. This is actually something that has persisted on the planet to this very day. Where Inuit has definitely improved because of Dorn and the Imperium, Medusa has been left the same deliberately to breed hardy people, kind of like Chigoris. So, thanks for making things better, Iron Hands. Great job. Now from here, we enter the dangerous zone. These are planets that are not just bad to live on, but where you are consistently under threat and can never feel safe. The constant danger will be ever present and color every facet of your life. There will basically be no reprieve or respite. And it could be completely unavoidable. This could be for a myriad of reasons. But I am pretty confident in how I ranked these ones. Starting us off at number 11 is Deliverance, the home planet of the Raven Guard and Corvus Corax. Now, the first thing you need to know about Deliverance is it's not actually a planet. It's a moon. You know, a moon without an atmosphere. It's actually used as a prison colony for the larger planet of Keovar, which is controlled by highly corrupt and tyrannical tech guilds. So, if you were born on Deliverance, you were either A, imprisoned for whatever reason, or B, were born to people who were imprisoned again for basically whatever reason, and forced to work and slave away on a penal colony. That's gonna put it really low from the outset. But what makes it worse than something like Chemos, which is also a desolate planet that's going to require constant toil, is that you have basically nowhere to go. The only reason anyone can live on this barren rock is because there are small bubbles of artificial atmosphere and gravity on the planet that you can't leave. You literally have nowhere to flee to. Corax would be able to eventually instigate a rebellion, but when he landed there, that's it. You had no opportunity, nothing. And the reason it's lower than planets like Chemos, or the other ones where you would have to constantly toil away to survive in the upper tier, is because in those cases, you're at least toiling away for yourself, your clan, and your family. Here, you're not even doing that. You're slaving away for something you may not even have done, or that could have been just a minor infraction. You are screwed. It's not for yourself. There is no self-determination. You just slave away until you die on that barren moon with the void of space just beyond the bubble. But if nothing else, at least you're marginally safe. But that can't be said for the next planet, Caliban. On the surface, Caliban might not seem that bad, but you have to remember, these tainted beasts of the warp and needed an entire order of knights across the world to keep them at bay so that people could at the very least live. The fact that if the knights failed in their duty at any capacity for even a moment, you could just be ripped to shreds by a giant monster thing, puts this planet pretty damn low on the list, coupled with the fact that it was near feudal and had really low levels of technology. The Lion, like other Primarchs, would do a lot to fix the planet, but up until his arrival, this planet was horrible. It was a complete death world, if I'm being honest. Now, any planet, to my opinion, where you have to get out of the door in the morning and pray, please God, don't let me get eaten this morning, really is going to be on the bottom of the list here. And no planet embodies that better than number 13, Fenris, home planet of Leman Russ and the Space Wolves. Fenris had all the same problems as Caliban, but worse. The beasts of Fenris were large and vicious, and they didn't even have an order of knights specially trained to protect them. It was up to the average person to basically fight for their survival at any given moment if something's just gonna burst out of the ice. Ice that was, again, more or less ever shifting, because Fenris is actually an oceanic world, except for the fact that it's frozen all the time. It is so cold and so miserable. And I'm sorry, but no amount of cool Viking culture is gonna make that palatable at all. You might freeze to death if you get lost at any point, you could just fall through the ice, you could get eaten by God knows what. It's absolutely abysmal. Now, changing pace from something cold and something ecological to something hot and man-made, the next planet, number 14, is Baal Secundus, home planet of Sanguinius and the Blood Angels Legion. Baal Secundus actually used to be pretty nice. It was a verdant green world, but when the Age of Strife came along, the planet devolved into civil war, which left it devastated, completely wiped of most ecological life, save for humans and mutated creatures, as well as completely soaked in radiation. On these other planets, you had the luxury of at least going outside for at least a bit, even if it was dangerous. On Baal, you had to wear clunky, makeshift radiation suits in order to even live. People would just get cancer and keel over dead if they didn't. The place was constantly soaked in rads, it was a complete desert, and the small human populations were at war with mutant hordes for dominance of what was left of the planet. You had constant conflict, you had a destroyed environment, the constant threat of radiation, and no real technology to help you survive or get off the planet that well. Everything on the other planets is more or less present here. Really, in this one, it's the radiation that tips the scale into this being definitely one of the worst. But we can go even worse without going into the worst category. The last planet on the list in the dangerous category is Nocturne, home planet of Vulcan and the Salamanders Legion. And a big part of this is, one of my favorites, geological instability. This is one of those planets that is basically a worse version of a different one. It's very similar to Medusa, but just dialed up in every way. Heavily volcanically active, constantly shifting crust, competition over what little land there is, as well as dangerous creatures like fire drakes who can survive the lava. More unstable than even Medusa, mind you, but what really puts it at the bottom of this tier is the Drukhari. You see, the planet Nocturne before Vulcan arrived was constantly under threat by Drukhari raiding parties who would kidnap people and take them back to Camorra. And that is a fate far, far worse than death. That's what makes this planet so awful. The fact that at any time, the Drukhari could sweep in and take someone you love or you back to some place that is like worse than hell. The closest thing you could possibly get to hell without actual hell is an enormous thing and a huge deal breaker in any semblance of livability. Now, last but not least, let's get into the worst category. These are the 3 planets who, in my opinion, ruined the galaxy because of their Primarch's inclusion on them. The Primarchs landing on the other planets were absolutely formative to their development, but the Primarchs that landed on these planets would be deeply affected by it in ways that would have unimaginable consequences. Number 16 being Barbarous, home planet of Mortarion and the Death Guard Legion. Now, Barbarous was a toxic hellscape. The planet was kept shrouded in pollution and plague winds, full of noxious chemicals that would kill anyone who got too close. The only livable parts of the planet were the valleys between the mountains where the smoke was not as bad, because up on those toxic mountain peaks were Xeno overlords who had horrible sorcerer powers and would lord over the population through terror, descending on the people to kill and eat them and kidnap them and just do any horrible thing they wanted without any repercussion or anything to check them. Mortarion would step in and one by one overthrow these rulers, but before he arrived, those people lived in helpless terror, unable to defend themselves or resist, and those creatures were nigh on invincible. It took a Primarch to give these people even the slightest sliver of a fighting chance. Honestly, this would definitely make it one of the worst planets on the list, but it's Mortarion's inclusion that would prove particularly damning. Because watching people suffer under these sorcerous aliens instilled in Mortarion a fervent hatred of sorcery and warpcraft. A hatred that would all come to a head when he would be the leading voice for the abolishment of the Librarius and the forbidding of sorcery by Space Marines at the Council of Nicaea, which would see Magnus the Red humiliated and Space Marine Psychers barred from practicing, leaving the Loyalists without one of their most effective tools to face the coming demonic threat, something actively commented on by the Ultramarines during the Battle of Khal. Now, as bad as this seems, it's really nothing compared to number 17 on the list, which is Chthoniya, the home planet of Horus Lupercal and the Luna Wolves, later sons of Horus. Now, on the surface of it, Chthoniya doesn't seem that bad by comparison. If it was just the planet it was, I would probably put it between Inwit and Nostromo, because Chthoniya was a depleted world very close to Terra. You see, when humanity had first set out, it was those planets closest to Terra which really did get kind of the worst of it because they were used and abused first, like Necromunda and Chthoniya for this example. Chthoniya was actually close enough to reach by sublight travel. The planet itself was a bunch of underground caverns and tunnels, which used to be abandoned mines, but were now populated entirely by gangs. The entire culture of Chthoniya was just gigantic gang culture and gang warfare. Very unsafe, no opportunity, and nothing to really look forward to on a planet like this unless you're particularly vicious or daring or stupid, if I'm being honest. Now, again, this would be really bad, but not the worst in the world. It's not even as bad as Deliverance, because hey, at least there's atmosphere, even if there's very little valuable resources. But the big thing is the effect that gang culture would have. You see, what planted the seeds of hate and doubt and bitterness in Horus Lupercal when the Emperor left for Terra was not just that he felt abandoned, it's because the Emperor said, Horus's glories are now my glories. Other Primarchs like Lionel Johnson or Gilliman wouldn't have taken that personally, and people give Horus a lot of very justified flack for his childishness about it. But you have to understand, Horus grew up and was first socialized in this gangster environment. In these organized crime cultures, respect is everything. If you let yourself be diminished or disrespected in front of your subordinates by another subordinate, everyone's gonna come for your throat. No one will look at you the same way again. You need to react harshly and immediately. And if a superior like the Emperor disrespects you, it will undermine your ability to command the respect of people under you. Because Horus was a gangster first and foremost, he took it in the way a gangster would. His ability to command his legion had been undermined. He had been insulted. And the only way you take an insult like that in gang culture is to take it personally and get back at somebody. In prison, they will have these things called do-boys, where someone who's usually the boss of a group or an area called a pod is going to command people to do things for them. Go do this, go do that. That's what a do-boy is. And Horus had felt like the Emperor had just made him his do-boy. You really can't take that lying down. When you factor that in, this upbringing, it kind of makes sense why Horus was so bitter by a knee-jerk reaction. But what could be worse than that? Well, by process of elimination, I think you know. The planet of Colchis, homeworld of Lorgar and the Word-Bearers. Colchis itself wasn't that bad. It was a desert planet, sure, but it wasn't particularly dangerous. Sure, there wasn't a very high level of technology, and most people lived generally a lower standard of living, but again, it was safe, it was stable, the environment while desert wasn't that bad. Remember, humanity flourished in deserts first and foremost, like in Egypt. And sure, a corrupt priesthood leading the planet isn't great, but I wouldn't even bother to put this one in the dangerous section, or even that too low down on the unpleasant section. However, it is the fact that that priesthood was worshipping chaos that makes all the difference. You see, the priesthood of Colchis, much like many planets like Nurth or even Cadia back during the heresy, had been unknowingly worshipping the ruinous powers and spreading their teachings. Lorgar, being who he is, was found by chaos-worshipping priests like Porphyron and later Erebus, and indoctrinated into this belief. Even if he abandoned it later on, it still survived in the ranks of the Word-Bearers, because they were drawn from that Colchisian priesthood. This directly leads to the beginnings of the heresy after Kalth. If it had been any other planet that Lorgar landed on, the heresy likely never would have happened. And that's why in my mind it is the single worst Primarch homeworld, because it led to the damnation of the galaxy. But what do you guys think? What in your mind is the worst Primarch homeworld? Do you think there's any worse than Colchis? Do you think my metric and grading system is completely off? I'd love to know what you guys think in the comments below, because this was entirely an opinion piece, and I think it went pretty well. But until then, I will see you in the next video.